Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We move on to the Kitabul Utq, the book of Emancipating a Servant. Let us take this first hadith from Ibn Umar radiallahu anh. He says that the Prophet ﷺ said, Man a'taqa shirkan lahu fi abdin fakana lahu malun yablughu thaman al-abdi قوم عليه قيمة العدل فأعطي شركاؤه حصصهم وعتق عليه العبد وإلا فقد عتق منه ما عتق. He says, if anyone emancipates his portion of a servant and he has enough wealth to pay for the freedom of the whole servant, then a fair price for the servant should be fixed and the partners should be given their share, and then the servant is fully freed. Otherwise, the emancipation of the servant is only to the extent of the first man's share. So what this hadith is talking about is if a servant is shared between partners, so two or more people share in a servant. Now, one of the owners frees his part of the servant. Now, what is obligatory upon him to do is that if he has enough wealth, he must pay his partners their share of the servant, and then the servant will be fully freed. And this is an obligation. If the first person who freed his portion of the servant does not have enough money, the hadith tells us that the servant is only freed to the extent which the first person has freed him. So he would be part servant, part free. So if he was shared between two men and one person frees him, but he does not have enough money to free the rest of him, then if this servant was in the service of both men, now he will only be in the service of one man. So if he was working for both men throughout the week, he will only now work for one person one half of the week, and the other half of the week he is free. In inheritance matters, he will receive inheritance because he is not totally a servant, but he will only receive the inheritance half of that which he would have received had he been free. Actually, what we know from another narration is that if the first person who freed his share of the servant does not have enough money, then we would require the servant to work, earn money, and pay for the rest of his freedom. So this is the option we would resort to if the first person does not have enough money to free the rest of the servant. And we find from this that the Sharia really wants the servant to be freed. That's why it enforces upon the first person who freed his share to free the rest of the share as well, so that the person can be freed totally. Sometimes the Sharia simply encourages people to set their servants free, such as the hadith where the Prophet says that when you free the servant, then for every limb of his which you free, Allah will free your limbs from the fire. At other times it sets the emancipation of a servant as a kafara. That also encourages freeing of a servant. Sometimes, as with mukataba, it orders you to enter into the contract with your servant that he will work, earn money, and pay you for his freedom. Sometimes a servant can be freed without the Sharia giving you a choice. For example, if you purchase a servant who is a near kindred of yours, for example your brother or your father or your mother or your sister or your aunt or your uncle, they will be automatically freed, whether you like it or not. Let's take the next chapter, that the wala belongs to the one who sets the servant free. From Aisha, she says that a woman called Barira came to her. She had entered into a mukataba contract with her masters that she would pay them for her freedom. She came to Aisha seeking financial help. Aisha told her, go to your masters, and if they like, I will pay for your freedom, but I will have your wala. That is to say, the right to inherit from you. So Barira did so. Then she came back to Aisha, and she said to her that they have refused. They said that Aisha can certainly pay for the freedom, but they want to have the wala of Barira. So Aisha mentioned this to the Prophet, and the Prophet told her, Ibta'i fa'a'tiqi fa'innamal wala'u liman a'taq. Purchase her and then free her, for the wala only belongs to the one who frees the servant. And then the Prophet stood up, gave a public sermon, and he said, مَا بَالُ أُنَاسٍ يَشْتَرِطُونَ شُرُوطًا لَيْسَتْ فِي كِتَابِ اللَّهِ مَنِ اشْتَرَطَ شَرْطًا لَيْسَ فِي كِتَابِ اللَّهِ فَلَيْسَ لَهُ وَإِنْ شَرَطَ 100 مرة شرط الله أحق وأوثق. What is the matter with some people? They make conditions contrary to the Book of Allah. Whoever makes a condition contrary to the Book of Allah, then he's not allowed to have it his way, even if he stipulated this condition 100 times. Rather, the condition of Allah is most worthy to be followed and most valid. This wala we speak of is the right to inheritance. This is, if a person dies and he has no family members to inherit from him, then instead of giving this wealth to the Baytul Mal, it will go to the person who owns his wala, that is, the person who freed him or her. The Prophet ﷺ said about the wala, Al-wala'u luhmatun ka luhmatin nasab. The wala is a relationship like the close relationship of the blood ties. Now this is okay to say that the wala belongs to the one who frees the servant, but what about if he frees the servant not really out of the goodness of his own heart, but rather for his own particular benefit? For example, purchasing a servant and freeing him for the sake of the zakah. Now he's doing it not because he genuinely loves to free that particular servant, but rather he's doing it so he can discharge his obligation of the zakah. Or for example, what about if you have to free a servant for a kafara? Conjugal relations with the wife during Ramadan, or making zihar on your wife, or killing a person accidentally, or breaking an oath. All of these have freeing a servant as a kafara. Well, what is zahir from this hadith is that it includes all types of emancipating a servant, whether you do it from the goodness of your heart, or whether you do it just to save your own self. There is a second opinion on the matter. Some scholars said that whoever frees a servant for zakah purposes, then the wala of this servant will not go to the one who frees the servant, rather it will go to the people of the zakah, who are the 8 different categories. So this wealth which the servant leaves behind after his death will go to the people of the zakah, the ahlul zakah, those who are entitled to the zakah, who are of course the 8 categories which the Quran mentions. What about the one who frees a servant for the sake of a kafara? They say that his inheritance will go to the fuqara, the poor people, because the kafara is normally for the benefit of the poor people. We feel that the safer option will be that if a person frees a servant because of a zakah or a kafara, that he should not take the inheritance of that servant after he dies, and rather he gives it either to the ahlul zakah if it was for a zakah, or to the fuqara if it was for a kafara. Because the zakah or the kafara, you have done it for the sake of Allah, you have given Allah Jalla wa Ala something, so it is not right for you to return back to it and take benefit from something which you have given out for the sake of Allah Jalla wa Ala. Just like if you give a sadaqah for the sake of Allah, you do not return back to it and take back any portion of it, and neither do you profit from your sadaqah. This is not right. What you have given away for Allah, you do not profit from it or take back anything of it. We can also take from the hadith the permissibility of the mukataba, and some scholars say this is an obligation if you know this servant to be righteous and of a good character. As for if you free him he's going to cause mischief, then no, you do not enter into the mukataba contract with such a person. The Zahiriya say it is wajib to offer the mukataba contract if you know there to be good in the servant. The majority of the scholars say it is recommended. We also find that the mukatab servant can go and seek help from someone else, just as Barira did. How much did Barira offer to pay? Well, we know that it was 9 awaq. 1 uqiyah is 40 dirham. We know this from the other narrations in the chapter. We find, interestingly, from this narration, that the Prophet told Aisha to go ahead with this contract of purchasing Barira, and even agree to this batil stipulation that the wala will be theirs. When Aisha did so, the Prophet after that got up and gave the hukum that the wala belongs to the one who frees the servant. In other words, when Aisha entered into this contract, making this batil stipulation, its presence was like its absence. So which means to say that even if 2 people agree to a batil condition, that is to say, a condition which opposes or contradicts the Quran or the authentic Sunnah, then even if they both agree to it, it must not be upheld, and that its presence is like its absence. And it cannot be said, oh, but you agreed to it, you have to keep to your word. No, you do not have to keep to your word if you both agreed to that which is haram. But then we ask another question. If they both agreed to this batil shart and the contract is concluded, can the other person say, well, because you did not respect the condition, I want to annul the contract because it has not happened out of my goodwill and I feel that I have been cheated or hard done by? Well, here we say that if this person who is complaining knew that this condition was a batil condition, it was against the Quran and the Sunnah, then he has no choice. He has to go ahead with the contract. Why? Because he knew what he was doing. As for if he did not know of the ruling, that this is a batil condition, then yes, he has a choice to annul the contract, because here he does have an excuse. We can also take the legislation of seeking consultation, because that's what Aisha did with the Prophet. She consulted him about this matter. We also take that sometimes the Prophet can give a general public khutbah due to a matter which crops up, such as in this hadith. When the Prophet says anyone who makes a condition not in the Book of Allah, it does not mean to say that if the Book of Allah does not mention this particular specific condition, then that condition is batil. No, it does not mean that. Rather, what it means that this is a condition which contradicts or opposes what we know of the Quran and the authentic Sunnah. Otherwise, there is literally no number to the number of conditions people can come up with. You cannot expect the Quran and the Sunnah to enumerate absolutely every single one of them, seriatim. So if somebody says, yes, I'll buy your car on the condition that it has done less than 5,000 miles, we do not find this condition in the Book of Allah. But the point is that the Book of Allah does not contradict this condition. We also take a fa'idah from this hadith that you can sell a mukatab servant, because the family of Barira sold her to Aisha, and then Aisha freed her. We can also take from the hadith that you're allowed to pay your debt in advance, that is, before the deadline, just as Barira is doing here with her family. The contract was 9 awaq, 1 uqiyah per year, but she brought that forward with the help of Aisha and paid off the debt before that time. But what about, let's say, a person owes £10,000 to be paid after 1 year, and he says, look, instead of waiting for 1 year and paying you £10,000, I'll pay you £8,000 now, and we'll be done with. Some scholars said this is not allowed, because it resembles paying 10,000 for 8,000. It's as if the debtor has taken the 10,000 and given 8,000. Other ulama said that it is allowed, because firstly, the debtor, the madeen, he's going to benefit as he's paying back less. So in our case, it would be £2,000 less. And as for the creditor, he would benefit in that he receives money earlier rather than later, and that is more favorable for him. And we also have a hadith to back up this point. In Ad-Daraqutni, the Prophet told the creditors of Abdullah ibn Haram, he tells them, Da'u wa ta'ajjalu, cut off some of the debt from him and take it early. And so what we say is that it is allowed because it is not paying 10,000 for 8,000. This is not from that type of contract. Rather, it is from letting go of some of your rights. And there's nothing wrong with letting go of some of your rights. So what happens in a case where the debtor wants to pay back the debt earlier than agreed to? Do we obligate the creditor to accept this debt? Well, the answer is yes, we do. That's the general point, because it is better for the creditor to take back the debt earlier than later. Unless, of course, there would be a harm in doing so. For example, it may be a particular time in which bandits are around. So if he takes back this wealth, he fears that the bandits may steal the wealth. So in a case like this, he says, no, I only want the wealth when it is stipulated, because at that time it will be safer. So here this is understandable, and we would accept the statement of the creditor. Or any other case in which there would be a harm on the creditor if he were to take back the debt earlier than stipulated. Going back to the hadith, here's a question. Why didn't the masters of Barira apply to revoke the transaction then? Because they did not receive the wala. Well, either it could be that the ruling was well known and that they knew that what they were doing is haram, and in such a case, like we said before, they do not have the right to revoke the transaction. Or it may be that they were content with the decision of the Prophet and did not then ask for a revoke of the transaction. And in that case, it would be something similar to the hadith in Sahih Muslim, where a man was wearing a gold ring. The Prophet took it off him and threw it away. Afterwards, others told him, why don't you take this ring which the Prophet threw away, and at least you could take benefit from it, such as, for example, selling it. And the man said, no, I will not take a ring which the Prophet threw away. So you see, the man was happy with the decision of the Prophet and did not want to go back to something which the Prophet rejected. And it would be a similar thing here with the family of Barira. In one of the wordings, the Prophet says, Kitabullahi ahaq wa shartullahi awthaq wa innamal wala'u liman a'taq. you see that in the Arabic this rhymes. So you are allowed to use rhyming speech as long as you do not try to force yourself to make the words rhyme. So it should flow naturally or with minimal effort. In another hadith from Jarir, he says that Barira's husband was also a servant. So the Prophet gave Barira a choice whether to remain with him or leave him, and she preferred to break off the ties of relations with him. And he says that if he were free, meaning the husband of Barira, then she would not have been given that choice. Now with this narration we have a second talking point. Barira's husband was named Mughith, and she was given a choice whether to stay with him or not. He would follow her in the streets asking her to take him back. And the Prophet said to his companions, "Are you not amazed at how much Mughith loves Barira, yet how much Barira hates Mughith?" Because normally in matters of love and hate, these are reciprocal relationships. If you love someone, they love you back in return, or if you hate someone, they hate you back in return. That's how it normally works. But this situation was contrary to what we are familiar with. That's why the Prophet asked, "Are you not amazed?" The Prophet interceded on behalf of Mughith. Yet Barira still refused when she realized this was not a hukum shar'i, but rather it is just an advice the Prophet is giving her. So as long as it's not a hukum shar'i, you can either take it or reject it. Most scholars say about this matter that if the woman is freed, she is given a choice whether to stay with her husband or not, as long as the husband is a servant. But if the husband is not a servant, she's not given a choice. The other opinion is that she's given a choice whether to stay with her husband or not, even if the husband is free. These scholars say that now she owns her own self, so she has the right to make her own decision as to whether to keep married to this man or not. However, the narration does say that had he been a freed man, she would not have been given the choice. One can also say that if she was forced as a servant into marrying this man, then she should be given the choice in the absolute sense, regardless whether the man is free or a servant. Let us take this next hadith. From Aisha, she reports she bought Barira from her people, from the Ansar, and they laid down the condition that the wala would be for them. But the Prophet said, "Al-wala'u liman waliya ni'mah." The wala is for the one who shows the favor or the grace. She also says that the Prophet had given Barira the choice to leave her husband, and her husband was a servant. And then Aisha also goes on to say that Barira was given some meat as charity. And the Prophet told Aisha, "لَوْ صَنَعْتُمْ لَنَا مِنْ هَذَا اللَّحْمِ." I wish you could prepare for us some of this meat. But Aisha said, "This has been given as a charity to Barira." And the Prophet said, "هُوَ لَهَا صَدَقَةٌ وَلَنَا هَدِيَّةٌ." It is a sadaqah for her, but from her to us it is a hadiyah. So in this narration, three distinct points are made. The first two we have spoken about already. But the interesting point is this third one here. Barira was given some meat as a sadaqah. And we know that the Prophet is not allowed to eat from the sadaqah or the charity, but he is allowed to consume a gift. The Prophet himself is not allowed to consume anything from charity nor from zakah. So we find that if some charity or zakah, let's say, is given to a poor person, and the poor person gives some of this to a rich person, a rich man is not allowed to receive from the zakah, we know that. But if he takes from some of this wealth from the poor person, then what's happening is that this rich man is taking this wealth as a gift, not as a sadaqah or as a zakah, even though originally this money came to the poor person by way of zakah. But you see that the avenues are different. So you're allowed to take this wealth as long as the wealth is halal in and of itself. So if it is pork, for example, then it does not matter how it is given to you, by zakah, by gift, charity, it does not matter. It will be haram. Or for example, if it is stolen or usurped, then the same ruling applies. It is haram in and of itself. From this narration we find that the wives of the Prophet are from his family, who are not allowed to take from the zakah payment. The Prophet said, "Inna as-sadaqa la tahillu li ali Muhammad." Sadaqah is not halal for the family of Muhammad. These are the family members of the Prophet who are the Banu Hashim. But the wives of the Prophet are not from Banu Hashim. Yet they are still included in this. And this hadith proves that, because they were not allowed to consume this meat, or so they thought. This is what Aisha says, that this is a sadaqah for Barira. So how can we consume of this? Because she knew that they're not allowed to consume the zakah payment. But the Prophet told them that This is not a zakah payment coming to you, rather it is coming to you as a gift, not as a zakah. This is why he said, هُوَ لَهَا صَدَقَةً. It is a sadaqah for her, for Barira. وَلَنَا hadiyah. And for us, meaning the Prophet and his wives, for us it is a hadiyah, a gift, which we can consume. We also find complementary evidence in the Quran. In Surah Al-Ahzab, Allah Jalla wa Ala says, إِنَّمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيُذْهِبَ عَنْكُمُ الرِّجْسَ أَهْلَ الْبَيْتِ وَيُطَهِّرَكُمْ تَطْهِيرًا. Allah only wants to remove the sins from you, O Ahlul Bayt, and to purify you completely. So he refers to the wives as Ahlul Bayt. And we know this is referring to the wives because just previously in the same ayah, he tells the wives of the Prophet, وَقَرْنَ فِي بُيُوتِكُنَّ وَلَا تَبَرَّجْنَ تَبَرُّجَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ الْأُولَى. And stay in your homes and do not adorn yourselves like the women of the Jahiliyyah did. There is a fine point that we need to note. The Prophet himself is not allowed to consume wealth of the zakah, nor of any other optional sadaqah. But what about the family of the Prophet? We know of a surety that the family of the Prophet, the Banu Hashim and his wives, are not allowed to consume from the zakah. That much we know. The Prophet said, إِنَّ الصَّدَقَ لَا تَحِلُّ لِآلِ مُحَمَّدٍ إِنَّمَا هِيَ أَوْسَاخُ النَّاسِ. The sadaqah is not halal for the family of the Prophet, it is only the dirt of the people. Most of the scholars, however, say that optional charity, that is not zakah charity, but the optional one, is halal for the family of the Prophet, but it is not halal for the Prophet himself. So note the difference. And this is the majority opinion. There is a minority opinion which says that both optional and wajib charity, all of it is haram for the family of the Prophet. The proof for the Jumhur is that the Prophet called the sadaqah awsakhun nas, the dirt of the people. Now this has to refer to the zakah, not the optional charity, because the dirt of the people has to be the zakah money. So when you give zakah, you thereby purify your wealth. And this is what zakah means. It means purification, as in how we say tazkiyatun nafs, purification of the soul. And Allah Jalla wa Ala says, خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً تُطَهِّرُهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا. Take from their wealth sadaqah, this refers to the zakah, purifying them and sanctifying them. So you remove the dirt from your wealth, you also remove the dirt from your character, that is to say, the dirt of greed. So the important point to note from this narration is that if the avenues are different, then the ruling will also be different. As long as the wealth itself is halal per se, so that is to say it is not stolen or usurped, or for example it is not khamr or pork and the like. Let's move to this next chapter. It is forbidden to sell the wala or to give it as a gift. From Ibn Umar, he says the Prophet forbade selling the wala or giving it as a gift. You'll remember what the wala is. It is the right of inheritance from the servant you have freed after he or she dies and does not have any other family member to take the inheritance. Now this right cannot be sold or given as a gift to another person. Rather, this right will belong to you if you freed the servant, and you are not allowed to pass this right on to somebody else. That is to say, to give it as a gift to somebody. Neither are you allowed to sell it to somebody else. So you would say to him, give me some money and I will give you the right of the wala, so that if that particular servant whom I have freed dies, you can take his inheritance. No, you're not allowed to say this to anyone. In the same way, you're not allowed to sell a family relation to anyone. You cannot say to somebody, pay me some money and I will treat you like a blood brother so that you could share in the inheritance and so on. Let's move to the next chapter. It is forbidden for a servant to take anyone else as an ally except the one who emancipates him. We'll pick one of the hadith from the chapter from Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man tawalla qawman بغير إذن مواليه فعليه لعنة الله والملائكة لا يقبل منه عدل ولا صرف." Whoever takes as his ally anyone other than those who freed him, then upon him is the curse of Allah and the angels. Neither the obligatory nor supererogatory acts of ibadah will be accepted from him. Now what this hadith means is that the freed servant is not allowed to say that his wala belongs to anyone other than the one who freed him. Because if he does this, then this would be clearly a transgression against the emancipator, meaning the person or the former master who freed him. Remember, the wala is the right of inheritance, and this right cannot go to anyone else. So the freed servant does not have the right to say that the right of my inheritance should go to anyone other than the one who freed him. However, the problematic area of the hadith is where the Prophet says, مَنْ تَوَلَّ قَوْمًا بِغَيْرِ إِذْنِ مَوَالِيهِ. Whoever takes the wala for anyone other than his proper emancipator without their permission. So these words here, without their permission, does this mean, using the mafhumul mukhalafa, that is to say the antithesis, can we then say that if he does give permission, then the wala can go to someone else? That is to say, if the emancipator gives permission that the wala can go to someone else, then can it go to someone else? Well, the mafhum of this hadith would suggest to us that yes, if the permission is given, then the wala can go to someone else. But as we have just heard from the previous hadith, it is that the wala cannot be sold nor given as a gift to somebody. So here we have a typical situation of mafhum versus mantuq. We have two different rulings. One ruling comes from the mafhum or the antithesis, which in Arabic we call the mafhum al-mukhalafa, and the ruling from the mafhum al-mukhalafa is that if the emancipator gives permission, then the wala can be transferred. But from the other hadith which we heard, the mantuq of it, which is the direct words spoken in the hadith, it tells us that the wala cannot be given as a gift, and neither can it be sold. So we have a clash. And so in a case of a clash, we go with the mantuq. We give this precedence or tarjih over the mafhum al-mukhalafa. Why? Because the dilala, the act of proving something, is much more direct here than the mafhum, which is an indirect form of evidence. So what we are saying is that we take the direct and give that precedence over the indirect. The Prophet says that adl nor sarf will be accepted from such a servant, or former servant in our case actually. What does adl mean? Some scholars said that the adl means fard actions and the sarf means nawafil actions. Another opinion is that adl means a ransom. He cannot ransom himself. And sarf means to turn something away. That is to say, he will not be able to turn the punishment away from himself. It is worth pointing out that there is another narration in the chapter in which Ali radiallahu anhu says that anyone who says that we have something besides the Quran and this parchment, then he has lied. The parchment contains some information regarding the ages of camels and the recompense for injuries, and it also records the words of the Prophet that Medina is sacred from Ayr to Thawr. Now the reason why we point this out is because the Shia claim that the Prophet gave Ali the Khilafah after him, and he should have been the first Khalifa. But Ali radiallahu anh kept that a secret because he was afraid of going against the masses. And of course this is a lie from the Shia, and that is to be expected from them. Ali radiallahu anh did not have any secret knowledge or exclusive knowledge from the Prophet, as he himself says. As for where he says that Medina is sacred from Ayr to Thawr, these two mountains, yes, Medina also has a sacred area, but it is less sacred than Mecca because, firstly, the sanctity of Medina is not agreed upon as opposed to the sanctity of Mecca, which is agreed upon. The Haram is agreed upon that it is sacred. Also, killing a game animal in the Haram of Al-Madinah does not incur a jaza. We have to sacrifice a similar animal from the Bahimatul An'am, whereas this is the case in the Haram of Mecca. Also from the differences that the trees and natural plant life of the Haram of Al-Madinah are allowed to be cut if there is a need to do so, whereas it is not permissible to cut off the natural plant life of the Haram of Mecca for merely a need. Another difference, the fourth one, is that in the Haram of Al-Madinah, if you pray in that place, the reward for the prayer is not multiplied, except for the Al-Masjid al-Nabawi. Whereas in the Haram of Mecca, there is a difference of opinion amongst the scholars. Some say that any prayer in the Haram of Mecca is multiplied, meaning to say its reward is multiplied. As for the 100,000 times the reward, then this is definitely specific to the Al-Masjid al-Haram. The Prophet said, Salatun fi masjidi hadha khayrun min alfi salatin fi ma siwahu illa al-Masjid al-Ka'bah. A prayer in this masjid of mine is better than 1,000 prayers anywhere else except for the Masjid of the Ka'bah. That is the Al-Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. During the Treaty of Al-Hudaybiyah, Hudaybiyah is a place part way in the Haram and part in the Hill. The Prophet, when he wanted to pray, moved in the Haram section to pray, as is reported in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. Definitely the Haram section is more virtuous to pray in than the section of the Hill, or outside the Haram. In the narration of Ali, he goes on to say that the Prophet said, فَمَنْ أَحْدَثَ فِيهَا حَدَثًا أَوْ آوَى مُحْدِثًا فَعَلَيْهِ لَعْنَةُ اللَّهِ وَالْمَلَائِكَةِ وَالنَّاسِ أَجْمَعِينَ لا يقبل الله منه يوم القيامة صرفا ولا عدلا. Whoever creates a hadath, which is a newly invented matter which creates fitna in this city of Medina, or even one who gives shelter to a muhdith, one who is creating a bid'ah or something that will produce fitna amongst the people, fitna of ideas or perhaps even warfare. So the one who even gives such a person shelter, then the curse of Allah and the angels and all of the people will be upon him, and Allah will not accept from him a adl, which is a fidya, nor a sarf, that the punishment cannot be averted from him. Let's move to the next chapter, the excellence of emancipating a servant. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, من أعتق رقبة مؤمنة أعتق الله بكل إرب منها إربا منه من النار. Whoever frees a believing servant, then for every organ which he frees, Allah will free his organ from the fire. And this hadith demonstrates al-jaza'u min jins al-amal. Your reward is of the same type as your action. You removed every organ of this servant from bondage, then Allah will free every one of your organs from the fire. And in this there is an encouragement to emancipate the servant. But note here that the hadith says that the servant needs to be a mu'min servant. That is where the virtue lies. As for if it is a kafir servant, then the danger is he will join the kuffar and strengthen their army. But that is where we took him from as a servant, from the army of the kuffar. Some of the ahadith in this chapter, they say, whoever frees a servant. It does not mention a believing servant. So do we say that we take the generality and we apply the hadith and the virtue to every servant, even a kafir one? The answer is no, because in the first hadith where he says a believing servant, this description, this wasf, believing, mu'mina, is something which is intended. And so it serves as a type of takhsis, so making specifications to the generality, which is well known in usul al-fiqh. And this happens when the restricted evidence has a description or a wasf which is intended in and of itself. It serves as a takhsis. So for example, if the Prophet says that the whole earth is purifying such that you can make tayammum from it, but in another wording he says that the dust of the earth is purifying. Is this a takhsis? The answer is no, because the word dust is not a wasf, it's not a description intended in and of itself. It's just an example of what the earth can be. Otherwise you can use sand and other things on the ground, soil and even mud to make tayammum, because the word which is dust is not a description intended in and of itself. Whereas, contrast this with our example, the word mu'mina is a description intended in and of itself, so it serves as a type of takhsis. Let's move to the last chapter of this book, the excellence of emancipating the father. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, لا يجزي ولد والدا إلا أن يجده مملوكا فيشتريه فيعتقه. A son can never truly repay his father, meaning for everything the father has done for him, except if he were to find his father as a servant, mamluk meaning owned by someone, and then he buys him as a servant and then frees him. Well, what is known is that if you purchase your father, who is a servant, your father will be automatically freed. It's not like you will set him free. No, he is automatically freed whether you like it or not. So basically when the Prophet says, and then he frees him, it means at the moment when he purchases him, he is automatically freed, without there being any extra action. We take from the hadith that it is very difficult for a son to repay the debt to his father, because of the immense effort and care his father bestowed upon him when he was a child. Okay, let's take some review questions. So question number 1. What is to be done if you free your share of the servant? Question number 2. Can an emancipated woman choose to stay with her servant husband? Give the evidence for this answer. Question number 3. What is the virtue of emancipating a servant?